She thought hating him would be the easiest thing she'd ever done. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a lot of things when it came to Draco Malfoy. We are starting the story now. The Ministry of Magic smelled like ambition and old stone, like ink dried too quickly on documents that decided people's fates. Hermione Granger had walked these corridors 100 times since the war ended, had learned to navigate the particular geography of post-battle bureaucracy, the way certain hallways hummed with unspoken apology, the way certain doors opened too easily now that the wrong people no longer guarded them. She knew this building. She trusted its rhythms. She did not trust the letter that had arrived with her morning tea. It sat on the corner of her desk now, parchment edges crisp, the ministry seal pressed in gold wax that caught the light from the enchanted windows. The windows showed a clear autumn sky, fabricated, as always, the true weather outside, irrelevant to whatever aesthetic the Department of Magical Cooperation preferred that morning. Hermione had never found the false sunshine comforting. Today, it felt almost mocking. Reconciliation initiative, mandatory participation, assignment effective immediately. She had read the letter 4 times. The words hadn't changed. Draco Malfoy's name appeared in the second paragraph, neat and official, stripped of all the weight it carried in her chest. Just a name on parchment, just letters arranged in a particular order. She told herself this with the focused deliberateness of someone diffusing something dangerous, and then she folded the letter along its original crease and placed it precisely in the center of her desk blotter, and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds before her hand moved without permission to straighten the already straight stack of files beside it. The Ministry's reconciliation initiative had been Kingsley's idea, she knew. She understood the politics of it, the necessity. The wizarding world had fractured in ways that didn't heal cleanly, and some wounds required more than time. They required intention. 2 years on from the battle, there were still former Death Eaters' families eating in separate corners of Diagon Alley. Still auras who flinched at certain surnames. Still children starting Hogwarts in September who had been taught to divide the world into categories that no longer officially existed. The initiative paired individuals from opposing sides of the war and assigned them a joint project, something concrete, something that required actual collaboration, not symbolic, not a handshake at a press event. Work, proximity, the radical, uncomfortable act of being in the same room as someone your history told you to hate, and staying there long enough to build something. Hermione believed in it. She had argued for it, in fact, in a committee meeting 3 months ago, had laid out the psychological research and the precedent for Muggle post-conflict reconciliation programs, with the particular fire she brought to things she was convinced of. She simply had not imagined she would be assigned to him. The conference room on level 4 was small and deliberately neutral. No house colours, no portraits of former ministers whose allegiances might complicate the atmosphere. Just pale walls and a long table of pale wood and 2 chairs positioned across from each other with the careful geometry of a duel. Someone in the initiative had a sense of humour, or perhaps no sense at all. Hermione arrived 4 minutes early and chose the chair with its back to the door, then immediately reconsidered and moved to the opposite one, then felt ridiculous about reconsidering, and remained standing entirely, her bag over one shoulder and her fingers wrapped around the strap with more force than was strictly necessary. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, he wasn't speaking, but the particular cadence of his footsteps in the corridor outside, unhurried in the way that expensive upbringings made unhurried, the kind of pace that had never needed to rush because the world had always waited. She knew that sound from 6 years of shared school corridors. She had hated it then, the sound of someone who had always assumed the space belonged to him. The door opened. Draco Malfoy looked like the war had rewritten him in a language she didn't fully recognize. He was leaner than she remembered. The adolescent angles of his face resolved into something sharper, more defined, though the sharpness now came from somewhere internal rather than from the sneering performance of cruelty he had worn like armor through their school years. His hair was shorter, less precisely arranged. He wore plain dark robes with no family crest visible, and the absence of it felt deliberate, a small, considered erasure. The dark mark was hidden beneath his left sleeve. She knew it was there the way she knew certain things she would rather not know. His eyes found her immediately, grey, still. That particular shade that had always reminded her of weather about to change. He looked at her across the length of the pale table, and something moved behind his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a confirmation of something he'd already braced for. His jaw tightened by a fraction. The line of his shoulders, already rigid, became a degree more so. "Granger," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, smoothed of its adolescent sneer, but carrying new weight in its place. Something measured, something careful. "Malfoy," she returned. They regarded each other across the table's length. The enchanted light overhead was steady and impersonal. Somewhere in the building's depths, a dictation quill scratched against parchment, audible through the walls. He moved first, pulling out the chair across from hers with a gesture that was neither aggressive nor conciliatory, simply functional, and sat with the composed stillness of someone who had learned to perform composure so long that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He set a leather folder on the table before him, dark green, monogrammed. Old habit, she thought, or old instinct. Even stripped of the crest on his robes, the monogram remained. She sat. The silence between them was textured, thick with the accumulated weight of every hexed corridor, every spoken slur, every moment in a war where their positions had been, without ambiguity, opposed. Hermione was accustomed to silences. She used them strategically, let them breathe when they needed to. But this one pressed against her sternum like a held breath, and she found herself wanting to fill it with something, anything, just to reduce the atmospheric pressure of the thing to manageable levels. She opened her own folder instead. "I've reviewed the assignment parameters," she said. The professionalism in her voice was reliable, a tool she'd sharpened over 2 years of ministry work. "The initiative wants us to co-develop a framework for integrating former combatants' children into a revised Hogwarts curriculum. Something that acknowledges the war's history without reproducing its divisions. I know what the assignment is." His voice was flat, not unkind precisely, just closed. "Then you'll know it requires actual collaboration." She looked up from the folder. "Not tolerance, not coexistence, collaboration." Something shifted in his expression. the faintest contraction around his eyes, the kind of micro-movement that happened before a defensive response was constructed and deployed. But the response didn't come. He looked at the folder before him instead, and his thumb moved once, slowly, along the edge of the cover. "I'm aware of the definition," he said. "Good." She returned to her notes. "Then we can start." They worked for 2 hours that first afternoon, and it was, she would not have predicted this, not a disaster. It was deeply uncomfortable in ways she had to keep disciplining herself not to show. Uncomfortable the way certain old injuries were uncomfortable in cold weather. A low ache that made itself known without being debilitating. But he was not what she had expected. He was not the boy who had called her mudblood in corridors and watched her with contempt, as though her very existence was an offense against the natural order. He was something harder to categorize. He contributed to the discussion with the particular quality of intelligence she had always, privately, reluctantly acknowledged he possessed. Cutting observations offered in terse, controlled sentences, a willingness to identify flaws in proposed approaches that she found, against her better judgment, useful. He did not apologize for anything. She had not expected him to. Not here, not today, not in a ministry conference room with pale walls and enchanted lighting. Apology, if it came at all from Draco Malfoy, would come differently. She understood that without knowing quite how she understood it. What she had not expected was the moment, somewhere in the second hour, when she referenced a Muggle study on post-conflict education reform, and he didn't flinch, did not bristle, did not insert a dismissal. He looked at the summary she slid across the table, read it with the same focused attention he gave everything else, and said, "The methodology's transferable. The cultural context needs adjustment." His eyes came up to hers as he said it. For approximately 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The study lay between them on the pale wood. His finger rested at its edge. The overhead light was steady, unhurried. Something in the air of the room had changed quality. Not warmer, not softened, but differently tensioned, like a string that had been wound to a different pitch without anyone quite deciding to turn the key. Hermione was the first to look away. She made a note in the margin of her folder. The pen scratched. The dictation quill somewhere in the walls continued its distant industry. "Agreed," she said. "I'll draft an adaptation framework by Thursday. I'll review it Friday." "Fine. Fine." The meeting ended at 5:30. They gathered their folders with the brisk efficiency of 2 people who had made a tacit, mutual agreement not to acknowledge what had just occurred, whatever it was, this thing that had moved through the air between them in a conference room on level 4. Hermione's bag strap was smooth against her palm when she lifted it, familiar, grounding. He reached the door first and opened it. Not for her. She understood intuitively that he was not performing a courtesy, simply leaving. But he paused on the threshold in a way that was a fraction of a second longer than egress required, and without turning back, said, "Granger." She stopped. The study. A beat. It was a good find. He left before she could formulate a response. His footsteps moved away down the corridor, the unhurried rhythm of them unchanged. She stood in the doorway of the conference room with the pale walls and listened to the sound of them recede, and felt something she could not immediately name stir in the cavity of her chest. Small, uncertain, not yet identifiable as anything she was willing to give a name to. She looked down at her folder. Her own handwriting covered the notes page in its characteristic density, the words layered and precise. In the margin, where she had written adaptation framework. Thursday, the ink had pressed slightly deeper than usual, the letters a fraction more deliberate. Outside the enchanted windows, the fabricated sky had shifted to evening gold without anyone having decided it should. She tucked the folder under her arm and walked out. Thursday arrived the way difficult things often did, quietly, without ceremony, giving no outward indication that it intended to matter. Hermione had drafted the adaptation framework in 2 sittings, the first on Tuesday evening at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, the second on Wednesday morning before the rest of the ministry had fully woken, in the particular hush of early corridors when the enchanted torches were still warming to their daytime brightness. She worked the way she always worked, thoroughly, with the focused intensity that had carried her through every examination, every impossible problem, every moment when the world had required her to be more capable than she'd known she was. The framework was good. She knew it was good. It drew on 7 sources, accounted for 3 different models of curriculum reform, and contained a section on trauma-informed pedagogy that she was quietly proud of. She had read it over 4 times before printing the final copy, and only on the 4th reading did she acknowledge, with some irritation at herself, that she had been imagining his response to each section as she refined it. Not to impress him. Simply, she told herself, to anticipate objections, to fortify the argument. That was all. The copy she placed on the conference room table Friday morning was crisp, unfolded, positioned in the center of his side of the pale wood, with the same precision she brought to everything. Then she moved to her own chair, opened her own folder, and directed her attention to her notes, and did not look at the door. She heard his footsteps at 8:53. He entered without knocking. The conference room had no particular protocol about knocking, she reminded herself, and stopped briefly at the sight of the document waiting for him. He picked it up, remained standing, read the first page with that particular quality of focused stillness, and she watched the movement of his eyes across the text from beneath the carefully neutral architecture of her own expression, and said nothing. He turned to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. "You included the Muggle methodology," he said, without looking up. "I included the adapted version, as we discussed. The 3rd subsection cites it directly. The 3rd subsection is strengthened by it. If you have a substantive objection, I don't." He turned another page. His voice held no inflection she could read cleanly. "I was noting it." She returned to her notes. The scratch of her quill against parchment was the only sound for a measure of moments. He continued reading, and she was acutely aware of him standing, the way his presence occupied the room's air differently than an absent person's, the faint scent of something clean and cold, like stone after rain, that she associated now, involuntarily, with these Friday mornings. That association had formed in only 1 week. She found it faintly alarming. He sat, opened his own folder, set the framework down with the particular care of someone who had decided, quietly, to treat it as worth treating carefully. "The section on house integration," he said, "is idealistic. It's aspirational. There's a difference." "Is there?" It wasn't quite a question. Yes. She set her quill down. Idealism ignores reality. Aspiration acknowledges it and proposes something better. The section doesn't pretend the divisions don't exist. It proposes a structured approach to addressing them. His eyes moved from the document to her face. The grey of them was neutral in the conference room's light, revealing nothing she could confidently interpret. His fingers rested flat on the table, the silver of his signet ring. The only jewellery he wore, she'd noticed, plain and old, and bearing no crest she recognised, catching the overhead glow in a single bright point. "You believe that?" he said. Not a challenge, more like verification. As though the concept of genuinely believing in something aspirational required confirmation that someone actually did it. "I do," she said. "Don't you?" The question arrived before she decided to ask it, and she felt it land between them with more weight than she'd intended. A personal question. An inappropriate one, perhaps, for the fourth meeting between two people who were professionally obligated to share a room and nothing more. She watched something move through his expression, a brief turbulence beneath the controlled surface, swiftly smoothed, and waited for the deflection. The Malfoy retreat into cold distance, which she had catalogued extensively over 6 years of enforced proximity. Instead, he looked down at the framework. "I believe some people can change their positions," he said. His voice was level, each word placed with the careful weight of someone navigating unfamiliar ground. Whether that translates to structural change, whether a classroom framework produces anything other than the appearance of integration. He stopped. His thumb moved along the document's edge. "I'm more skeptical of the architecture than the intention." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 weeks of meetings. Possibly the most honest thing he had said to her in their entire acquaintance, which stretched back to an 11-year-old boy on a train platform who had offered his hand with the particular confidence of someone who had never doubted it would be taken. She had not taken it then. She noted distantly that the memory surfaced without its usual sharpness. "That's a fair objection," she said. "Write it in the margins, all of them. I want your actual analysis, not a polite review." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, too restrained for that, too carefully withheld, but its ghost, the faint structural suggestion of one, gone before she could examine it. He picked up his quill. "As you like," he said. They worked through the morning into early afternoon. The enchanted windows showed October light, amber-tinged and slanted, genuine-looking enough that Hermione sometimes forgot it was manufactured. She had brought lunch, a habit from long ministry days, and at 12:30 she unwrapped it without thinking, and then was suddenly, acutely conscious of the social geography of eating in front of someone who was neither colleague nor friend, nor anything she had an established vocabulary for. He didn't comment. His attention remained on the document before him, annotated now in his handwriting. She could see it from across the table, precise and slanted. The penmanship of someone who had been made to practice it until it was correct. She found herself wanting to read the notes, strictly for the project, she told herself, and was annoyed at herself for the qualification. At 1:20, he closed his folder. "The section on intergenerational trauma," he said, without preliminary. You've approached it theoretically. It needs to be applicable across different backgrounds. It needs to acknowledge that for some students, the trauma isn't intergenerational, it's immediate. A pause, precise and controlled. 2 years isn't long. The room became very still. She set down the piece of bread she'd been holding. The afternoon light moved imperceptibly across the pale table. She understood with the particular acuity she brought to subtext that he was not speaking abstractly, that the clinical language of the framework had brushed against something real and present in him, something that did not have the cushion of historical distance, and that what he had just offered her was, without ceremony, without apparent intention, a glimpse of something unshielded. She chose her next words the way she chose difficult words in examinations, with precision, with awareness of what each one cost. "You're right," she said. "I'll revise that section." He looked at her. The look lasted slightly longer than professional exchange required. There was something in it she couldn't fully read, a quality of cautious assessment, as though he were trying to determine whether she had understood what he'd said, and whether understanding it had changed something in her regard, and whether that change, if it existed, was something he wanted or feared. She met his gaze and did not look away. "Thank you," she added, quiet, direct. His jaw tightened fractionally. He nodded once and opened his folder again. The moment receded, the way certain moments did, absorbed back into the texture of the afternoon, the scratch of quills and the distant ministry sounds and the manufactured October light. And yet it left something behind in the room's atmosphere, a slight alteration in the quality of the air between their two chairs, as though the temperature had shifted by a single degree in some direction she couldn't name. They finished at 3:30. Hermione gathered her papers with the usual efficiency, noting the density of his marginalia on the returned framework, with a focus that was entirely professional. The annotations were sharp, thorough, genuinely useful. She had expected less. The acknowledgement of that expectation and its failure to be met sat somewhere at the edge of her awareness, like an unsettled equation. She was sliding the document into her bag when he said, "Granger." She looked up. He was standing, his folder closed, his expression arranged in its habitual, careful neutrality. But his eyes held something she'd been noticing with increasing frequency, that quality of something pressed close to the surface and then withdrawn before it fully emerged. "The framework is good," he said. The same words as last week about the study. But the weight behind them was different now, more deliberate, less oblique, as though he had decided incrementally that the distance between them warranted slightly less maintenance. She regarded him for a moment. Outside, the fabricated light continued its amber slant. "So are your annotations," she said. The almost smile moved through his expression again, and this time it stayed a fraction of a second longer before he collected it back into neutrality. He moved toward the door. She watched the set of his shoulders, still rigid in their default posture, still carrying the architecture of someone who had learned to take up space defensively, and thought for the first time that there was something exhausting in it, the constant maintenance of that particular shape. She thought this without hostility. That surprised her more than the thought itself. In the corridor outside, she fell into step several meters behind him. not deliberately, simply the natural consequence of different walking speeds, and watched him move through the ministry hallway with that unhurried cadence that no longer struck her as arrogance. It struck her now as something more like endurance. The performance of someone who had decided that forward motion, at whatever pace, was the only option remaining. He turned left at the atrium junction. She turned right. She did not look back to see whether he did. At her desk, she opened the annotated framework and began reading his marginalia from the first page. His handwriting was easier to read than she'd expected, the slant consistent, the letters formed with a kind of disciplined clarity that she found, and she was aware of how absurd this was, oddly pleasing to follow. The section on intergenerational trauma had a single note beside it, written in smaller letters than the rest, pressed closer to the margin as though added more quietly. Consider that proximity to violence is not the same as complicity in it. Some students will need this distinction clearly made. She read it twice. Then she drew a slow line beneath it in her own ink and wrote, "Yes." The enchanted window behind her showed evening arriving over a London skyline that didn't exist, all amber dissolving into early dark, and Hermione sat in its fabricated light and felt something in her chest shift by a degree she was not yet ready to measure. November arrived in the wizarding world the way it always did, without apology, stripping the last warmth from the air and replacing it with something honest and austere. The ministry's enchanted windows finally conceded to the season, showing skies of pewter and iron that felt, for once, more truthful than the fabricated sunshine of October. Hermione found she preferred it. There was something clarifying about a sky that didn't pretend. She had stopped counting their meetings by number. She was aware of this, in the way she was aware of most things she would rather not examine too closely. Peripherally, with the disciplined inattention of someone who has decided that a particular door does not need opening yet. They had settled into a rhythm. That was the word she used when she thought about it, which was not often, or at least not as deliberately as it had begun to occur. A rhythm, neutral, professional, the natural consequence of two organized people working toward a shared deadline. They met Tuesdays and Fridays. He was never late. She was always early. The conference room had begun to feel less like a neutral space and more like a specific place, accumulating the small details of their particular occupancy. The way she always sat with her back to the window, the way he always placed his folder on the left side of the table, the particular arrangement of their notes that had evolved without discussion into a shared geography of the pale wood surface. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, thoroughly, involuntarily. On the Tuesday of the third week of November, she arrived to find him already there. He was standing at the window, the real one, not enchanted, a narrow pane set high in the conference room wall that showed a slice of actual London sky. And he was looking at it with the focused blankness of someone whose thoughts had taken them somewhere the room didn't contain. He hadn't heard her enter, or if he had, he hadn't moved. She stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, her bag in hand, and observed him in the unguarded way that was only possible when someone didn't know they were being observed. He looked tired. Not in the superficial way of missed sleep, but in the deeper register. the particular exhaustion that settled in the posture, in the set of the jaw, in the quality of stillness that was less composed than it was depleted. His left hand hung at his side. His right rested on the window ledge. The grey sky beyond the glass was the same grey as his eyes, and Hermione had a sudden, strange sense of something rhyming between the man and the weather, both stripped of pretense, both showing their actual conditions without the management of an audience. She set her bag down. The soft sound of it reached him, and he turned. The composure reassembled itself in the fraction of a second between his turning and facing her. She saw it happen, the quick internal gathering, the mask resuming its position. And the Draco Malfoy, who looked at her across the conference room, was the one she knew. Controlled, attentive, revealing nothing voluntarily. But she had seen the moment before the mask. She held that knowledge quietly and said nothing about it. "You're early," she said instead. "So are you." A beat. "You're always early." "You're never early." She moved to her chair. "Is everything all right?" The question surprised him. She could tell by the fractional pause before his response, the brief recalibration. "Fine," he said. The word was smooth, well practiced. The word of someone who had answered that question the same way for so long that the automatic quality of it had become invisible to him. It was not invisible to her. She did not push. She had learned over these weeks that Draco Malfoy operated under a particular hydraulic logic. Pressure produced resistance, always, and the only way to create genuine opening was to leave space and let him choose whether to fill it. It was counterintuitive for her. She was, by nature, someone who pushed, who excavated, who believed that named things were more manageable than unnamed ones. But she had noticed that the things he offered voluntarily, the annotation about trauma, the quiet admission about skepticism, the marginal notes that sometimes ran longer than strictly necessary, had more substance than anything she might have pried loose. So she opened her folder. She uncapped her quill. She gave him the space. They worked through the morning's agenda, a restructured second section, a proposed timeline for ministry review, the outline of a pilot program for 3 Hogwarts houses. The work was genuinely engaging. She had not expected that either in those first uncomfortable weeks. She had anticipated tedium punctuated by managed hostility. Instead, she found that their approaches to the work were differently angled in ways that produced something better than either alone. His skepticism sharpening her idealism, her structural rigor anchoring what might have otherwise been his tendency toward the rhetorically elegant but practically vague. She had not expected to respect his mind. She was honest enough to admit privately that she should have. At 11:30, he pushed the timeline document aside and said, "The pilot program, 3 houses, is arbitrary. It's practical. We can't pilot across all 4 simultaneously. We should include Slytherin." She looked up. He was looking at the document, not at her. His quill rested between 2 fingers, not writing, just held. The Initiatives Committee suggested starting with the 3 houses that weren't associated with Death Eater recruitment. His voice was even. "Yes, I read the committee's reasoning." The room held its breath. Hermione kept her expression carefully steady, aware that this was the kind of moment that could calcify into defensiveness on both sides if she let it. The old grooves of their shared history running close to the surface, ready to channel any misstep back into familiar hostility. The committee's concern, she said, measuring each word, was that including Slytherin in the first cohort might compromise the pilot before it established any traction. If it becomes associated with us, his eyes moved to hers, no evasion in them. Say what you mean. With the families whose children carry the most complicated inheritance from the war. She held his gaze. That's not a judgment. It's a recognition that those students need a program that's robust before it meets the hardest cases. Something moved through his expression. Not the quick turbulence she'd seen before. Something slower, more considered, making its way from a deeper place. Those students, he said quietly, are currently sitting in a school where 3/4 of the population has been taught, explicitly or otherwise, that their name means something dark. Deferring them to a later cohort doesn't protect the program. He paused. It confirms what they already suspect. The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. It had weight and direction. Hermione felt it against her sternum. Not uncomfortable precisely, but pressing. She thought about what he'd said, and she thought about the marginalia on the trauma section, and she thought about a boy on a train platform whose hand had been refused by an 11-year-old who hadn't known yet what refusal costs. You're right, she said. He looked at her steadily. I'll make the case to the committee, she continued. All 4 houses in the pilot. I'll write the argument this week. I'll co-sign it. Offered without hesitation, and she understood the weight of that. His name on a document, his name that carried everything it carried, placed deliberately beside hers on something he believed in. She nodded. Good. They returned to the document. But the air in the room had shifted again. That incremental degree of change she'd been cataloguing across these weeks, each meeting adding its fraction, the accumulated total now something she couldn't pretend was negligible. She was aware of him with a specificity that was difficult to justify on purely professional grounds. The way the grey light from the high window caught the side of his face. The way his handwriting changed in the margins when he was engaged with an idea versus when he was simply annotating. Looser, faster, the controlled slant giving way to something more immediate. The way he held his quill differently when he was thinking versus when he was writing. The slight drum of it against his knuckle that she had come to associate with a mind working at its own pace. These were observations, not feelings. She was clear about this. At 1:15, she made tea. It was an entirely mundane act. The small ministry kettle in the corridor outside, 2 cups, the automatic muscle memory of it. And she had done it without thinking, and was halfway back to the conference room before she registered that she'd made 2 cups rather than 1, and that the second was black with no sugar, which was how she had seen him take it in the atrium canteen on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when she had not been paying attention to him and therefore had not noticed. She set his cup on his side of the table without comment. He looked at it, then at her. She had already looked back at her folder, her quill moving, the particular studied nonchalance of someone who has decided a thing is not worth acknowledging. A long moment passed. Thank you, he said. The same quietness as before, but carrying something additional. Careful quality, like a word being placed down gently on a surface that might or might not hold it. She said, not looking up. The tea steamed between them. Outside, the November sky pressed its grey weight against the high window. Hermione made a note in the third section margin, something about pilot assessment metrics, and felt the warmth of the cup through her fingers and the strange, inconvenient warmth of something else entirely, somewhere less locatable, less easy to annotate. He stayed later than usual that afternoon. She was aware of the time passing in the way she was aware of him, peripherally, without wanting to be. At 3 o'clock, he had shown no sign of gathering his things, and she had not mentioned it, and they had continued working, and the conversation had drifted at some unidentifiable point from the framework's third section to something less structured, something closer to exchange. She had said something about Hogwarts, about her first year, the troll, the way terror had clarified into a kind of belonging she hadn't expected. She had offered it without particular intention, a small piece of genuine history, and he had listened with the focused attention he brought to everything, and then said, very quietly, that he remembered his first year as a performance, that every day had felt like an examination he hadn't been told how to prepare for. "What were you being tested on?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Whether I'd inherited the right values." He turned his quill once between his fingers. "I had." The past tense sat between them like something placed carefully on the table. Had, the small word doing enormous silent work. She looked at his profile, the sharp angle of it in the grey light, the jaw set in its habitual control, and thought about what it cost to use that tense, about what it meant to revise your own history with a single syllable. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. Outside, the afternoon had moved toward early dark. When they finally gathered their things, unrushed, without the brisk efficiency of earlier weeks, the corridor beyond the conference room was quiet, the ministry settling into its end-of-day rhythms. He held the door for her, not with the charged deliberateness of a gesture being made, but simply, naturally, the door in his hand, her passing through it, the small, ordinary proximity of two people leaving the same room. Her sleeve brushed his arm in the doorway, the barest contact, meaningless by every measurable standard, gone before it had properly registered. She felt it for the rest of the walk to the atrium. Behind her, the conference room held the ghost of their afternoon. 2 cups, a framework covered in 2 different hands, the particular quality of air that accumulates in spaces where something has been incrementally and without announcement beginning. The letter came on a Wednesday. Hermione found it on her desk between a stack of interdepartmental memos and a report she'd requested from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Unremarkable in its positioning, ordinary in its sealed envelope, her name written on the front in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. She opened it with the automatic efficiency of someone who received a great deal of correspondence, and read it, standing, her coat still on, her bag still over her shoulder. It was from a journalist, Rita Skeeter's former assistant, now operating independently under the banner of a publication called The Uncensored Cauldron, a name that managed to sound both inflammatory and self-congratulatory simultaneously. The letter was polite in the particular way of things that are not polite at all, the courtesy a thin surface over something considerably less refined. The journalist had, he wrote, been investigating the ministry's reconciliation initiative and had come across certain information regarding Hermione's assigned partner. He wanted to offer her the opportunity to comment before publication. The information, outlined in the letter's second paragraph, was this. Draco Malfoy had petitioned the initiative to be assigned a Muggle-born partner. Specifically, he had submitted the request in writing 6 weeks before the assignments were announced, citing, and here the journalist quoted directly from what could only have been a leaked internal document, a personal obligation to confront the specific nature of his wartime conduct in the most direct manner available. He had asked for her, not by name, the petition hadn't named her, but by category, by the precise definition of everything he had spent 6 years making her feel was a deficiency. Hermione read the letter twice. Then she sat down slowly in her chair. The journalist wanted a comment on what he was framing as a manipulation. Malfoy engineering the assignment, circumventing the initiative's randomized process, positioning himself adjacent to a high-profile Muggle-born for what the letter delicately implied might be rehabilitative optics rather than genuine intention. Does Granger know she was chosen? The letter asked in its final line. Or has the process she publicly championed been used against her? She sat with it for a long time. Her coat grew warm and then uncomfortable, and she didn't take it off. Through the enchanted window, the fabricated sky showed a neutral mid-morning blue that had nothing to say about any of it. The thing was, and this was what kept her sitting, kept her still, kept her from the immediate clarifying anger she would have preferred. She didn't know what she felt. The information moved through her in layers, each one carrying a different charge. The first layer was the instinctive recoil. She had been selected, categorized, chosen as someone's exercise in self-confrontation. The second layer, arriving immediately behind the first, was the uncomfortable acknowledgement that the petition, as described, was not cynical. A personal obligation to confront the specific nature of his wartime conduct. That was not the language of optics. That was the language of someone who had looked at what they'd done and decided that looking away was no longer an option. The third layer was the one she didn't want to examine. The weeks of Tuesday and Friday mornings, the annotated framework, the cup of tea, the had in his voice when he spoke of inherited values. And beneath all of it, the question of whether any of it would have happened without the deliberate architecture of his own petition. Whether the thing she had been, involuntarily and inconveniently, beginning to feel was built on a foundation she hadn't been told about. She did not go to the Friday meeting. She sent a note, professional, brief, citing a departmental conflict that was not entirely fabricated, but was not the reason, and spent the morning at her desk, working on other things with a focus that required active maintenance, like holding a door shut against pressure from the other side. She did not respond to the journalist. She thought about it. She thought specifically about what it would mean to have her comment in print. The Hermione Granger who had championed the initiative, now expressing reservations about her assigned partner's motives. The way that story would move through Wizarding London, the damage it would do to the program, to the genuine work they had produced, to the possibility that what they were building actually mattered. She thought about all of this with rigorous honesty and concluded that it was not the reason she stayed silent. The reason she stayed silent was that she didn't know whether she was angry. She should have been. She understood intellectually the architecture of that anger, the entitlement implied in selecting someone without their knowledge, the paternalism of deciding that she was the right instrument for someone else's moral rehabilitation, the way it reframed every moment of their developing, whatever it was. She turned these over, examined them, and found them structurally sound. She could be angry. She had every right to be angry. But when she closed her eyes and sat with the letter's information, what she felt beneath the architecture of justified anger was something quieter and more disorienting. She felt the annotation in the margin. Consider that proximity to violence is not the same as complicity in it. And she felt the quality of his voice when he'd spoken about children who wouldn't have the cushion of historical distance. And she felt, with a clarity she would rather not have had, that the petition described in the letter was not manipulation. It was an act of the most uncomfortable kind of courage, the private kind, the kind with no audience, the kind that cost something real. She was still angry, but the anger was more complicated than she wanted it to be. The following Tuesday, she went to the meeting. He was already there, early again, as he had been that other Tuesday, though this time he was seated rather than standing at the window. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the moment of careful assessment that moved across his expression, reading her face for information, for the quality of whatever she was carrying into the room. She set her bag down, sat, opened her folder. "You missed Friday," he said. "I had a conflict." A pause. She could feel him deciding something on the other side of the table, the particular atmospheric pressure of a person choosing between retreat and advance. "Granger." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a faint tectonic tension. "Did you receive correspondence this week about the initiative?" Her quill stopped moving. She looked up. His expression was controlled, always controlled, but the grey of his eyes held something she recognized now as the closest he came to visible distress. A still, careful quality, like water that looks shallow and is not. "You know about the letter," she said. "The journalist contacted my office as well." His jaw tightened by the fraction she had catalogued. "I imagine he contacted the ministry's press office. I imagine it will be in print within the week, regardless of what either of us says." "Did you petition for a Muggle-born partner?" The question was direct. She had decided between Wednesday and today that directness was the only approach she was capable of, that anything circuitous would simply be a way of avoiding the thing, and she had spent enough of her life refusing to avoid things. He looked at her across the pale wood. The conference room was very quiet. "Yes," he said. One word. No elaboration. No preemptive defense, no careful framing, just the acknowledgement, placed between them cleanly. She had expected the admission to simplify something. It didn't. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't relevant to the work." "It was relevant to..." She stopped. Her hand had moved to her sleeve cuff, fingers finding the button there, a small reflexive anchor. She made herself stop. "It was relevant to me." Something shifted in his expression. The controlled surface admitted briefly a crack. Not dramatic, not a collapse, simply the hairline fracture of something that had been sealed too long. "I know," he said quietly. "Then why?" "Because if you had known at the beginning, you would have left." He looked at her steadily. "You would have walked out of this room on the first day and requested a reassignment, and you would have been right to. And the work." He stopped. A muscle moved in his jaw. "It matters. What we're building matters." The room held the words. Hermione felt them settle into the air, felt the specific weight of "we" in that sentence. Not rhetorical, not performed, simply used, as though it had quietly become accurate somewhere in the accumulated Tuesdays and Fridays, without either of them filing the paperwork. "That wasn't your decision to make," she said. Her voice was even. She had worked for that evenness. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. No qualification. No redirection." She watched him sit with the acknowledgement, the particular quality of someone who has decided that the truth, unadorned, is the only thing left worth offering. His hands rested flat on the table. The signet ring caught the light. He was not looking away. And this specific thing, the staying present in the accountability without flinching from it, without dressing it in mitigating language, was what made the anger shift again in her chest. Not disappear, not resolve, just move. Reveal something underneath it that she was not prepared for. She looked at her folder. The neat lines of her own writing blurred slightly at the edges before she blinked them clear. "I'm going to need time," she said. "I know. I'm not saying I'm walking away from the project." She wasn't sure, even as she said it, whether she was reassuring him or herself. "But I need time," he said. "Yes." She nodded, looked down at the document before her. The adaptation framework, now in its fourth revision, covered in two different styles of handwriting so thoroughly interwoven that, in the margins where they'd both responded to the same section, their annotations had begun to form something that looked, to an outside eye, like a conversation. She saw him see it too, his gaze moving across the document with the same recognition, the same complicated awareness of what was visible there in ink. She did not leave. They worked. It was not comfortable. The air between them carried a new friction, raw and unresolved, every exchange slightly more careful than it had been before. But they worked, because the work was real, and because stopping it would have been a different kind of loss than the one she was already navigating. At the end of the afternoon, gathering her things, she paused. "The journalist," she said. "I haven't responded." He looked at her. "I won't," she said. "Not in the way he wants." Something moved through his expression. Deep, brief, swiftly contained. He nodded once, and she understood that the nod was not relief exactly, but something it was too soon to name. She walked out into the corridor without looking back, and the absence of his footsteps behind her was a specific, textured silence. The silence of someone remaining still, remaining in the room she had just left, and she felt it against her back all the way to the atrium lift. December came in hard and without transition, the way it did in Britain. Not a gradual cooling, but a sudden declaration. The air changed overnight into something that bit at exposed skin and turned every exhaled breath visible. The ministry's enchanted windows finally abandoned their pretense entirely, and showed honest winter. Iron skies, bare trees, the occasional suggestion of sleet moving sideways across a cityscape that didn't technically exist outside the building's walls, but felt, in its grey accuracy, more real than any manufactured blue had managed. Hermione walked to work. She always had, when the weather permitted, finding the 20 minutes useful for the particular quality of thinking that movement enabled. December did not technically permit it. Her coat was insufficient, her scarf perpetually slightly damp by the time she arrived. But she continued anyway, because the alternative was the flu, and the flu deposited her directly into the ministry's atrium without transition, without the buffer of open air and her own unobserved thoughts. And she needed that buffer more than usual this month. She and Draco had not spoken outside their scheduled meetings since the letter. This was, she told herself, appropriate. They were colleagues on a ministry project. Their interactions had a defined scope and a defined location and a deadline in late January when the framework would be submitted for committee review. Everything within those parameters continued to function. Everything outside them was territory she had not yet determined how to navigate. The work was good. That was the persistent, inconvenient fact that complicated every attempt she made to reduce their association to something simpler. The framework had developed in December into something she was genuinely proud of. The pilot program proposal in particular, which now included all 4 houses and a trauma-informed approach to its first cohort that incorporated both her research and his revisions with a fluency that made the seams nearly invisible. The committee liaison who had reviewed their preliminary draft had described it as the most sophisticated proposal the initiative had received. She had read that feedback at her desk and felt the warm, clean satisfaction of good work, and then felt the more complicated warmth of knowing exactly whose annotations had sharpened the sections the liaison had specifically praised, and then set both feelings aside with the careful efficiency of someone managing a full inbox. She was not, she told herself, avoiding him. Their meetings continued. She was present, prepared, professional. If the quality of the air between them had altered, if the previous ease of their late afternoon conversations had contracted into something more formal, more contained, that was simply a recalibration to appropriate professional distance. That was correct. That was what the situation required. She believed this with the specific focus of someone who knows that the moment they stop concentrating, the belief will dissolve. On the 2nd Tuesday of December, he arrived with snow on his shoulders. It had started that morning, the first proper snow of the season, and she had watched it from her office window with the complicated pleasure of someone who associated it simultaneously with beauty and with the worst winter of her life. He came in from the cold in a way she hadn't seen before, the composed exterior slightly disrupted by weather, his colour higher than usual, a few flakes still caught in his hair before the warmth of the building reached them, and the very ordinariness of it, the simple humanity of someone arriving cold and slightly undone by weather, did something to the careful distance she had been maintaining. She looked at her folder immediately. They worked through the morning's agenda with the usual efficiency, but she was aware of the difference in register, the formality she had introduced, the slight increase in professional distance that she maintained like a maintained position, and the way he matched it. Not mirroring, he wasn't reflecting her temperature back to her in a simple way, but adapting, giving her the space she had indicated she needed, which was the correct response, the respectful response, and which she found irrationally, faintly irritating. She wanted him to push back. She recognized this want and found it absurd. She had asked for distance, implicitly but clearly, and he was providing it. And the part of her that found this irritating was the part she was currently not on speaking terms with. At 11:30, he said, "The committee wants a presentation in January, in addition to the written submission." "I know. I received the same memo." "We'll need to prepare it together." "Of course." A pause. The quality of it was different from their early silences. Those had been dense with history, loaded with the weight of everything they'd been to each other before this room. This silence was thinner, more recent. The weight in it was not of the past, but of the past 6 weeks, which was a different and in some ways more difficult thing. "Granger." He set his quill down. She kept her eyes on her document. "This isn't working." She looked up. His expression held the particular quality she had come to read as Draco Malfoy at his most honest. Not the composure dropped entirely, never that, but worn thinner than usual, the maintenance of it visible as effort rather than automatic. "The project is working," she said. "The project is fine." His voice was even. "This," a slight movement of his hand, indicating the space between them, the table, the quality of the air. "This has become something that is affecting the project." She set her own quill down. "I told you I needed time. You did, and I have given you time. 6 weeks of time." He looked at her directly. "I am not asking you to have resolved anything. I am asking whether we are going to be able to get through January without this formality undermining what we've built." The word formality carried a precise kind of criticism, she noted. Not cruelty, not a Malfoy dismissal, simply an accurate identification of the thing she had constructed and its cost. "What would you suggest instead?" she asked, and was aware, as she asked it, of the genuine quality of the question. She wasn't being rhetorical. She didn't know. He was quiet for a moment. His finger moved along the edge of his folder, that small habitual gesture she had catalogued without meaning to, the slight press of pressure that indicated thought. "I would suggest," he said carefully, "that you tell me what you actually feel, rather than managing it." The room was very still. Hermione looked at him across the pale table and felt the sentence arrive in her chest with the force of something precisely aimed. Because the thing she had been doing for 6 weeks, the careful folder opening and quill uncapping and maintenance of professional register, was exactly management. Thorough, competent management of something that refused, despite her best efforts, to be fully administered. "I feel." She stopped, started again. "I feel that the situation was complicated by information I wasn't given. That, what I thought was developing between us." She stopped again, more sharply, aware of what she had just said. Developing between us. She had said it. She had not intended to say it. He had gone very still across the table, not the controlled stillness of his default composure. A different quality entirely. The stillness of someone who has just heard something they had not allowed themselves to anticipate. "What you thought was developing," he said. His voice was careful, each word placed precisely, the way someone places weight on uncertain ground to test it before committing. She looked at her folder. Her hands were flat on the table. The point is that I didn't have full information. No. He paused. But the information, when you had it, did it change what you... He stopped. His jaw tightened. He was not, she recognized, accustomed to sentences that ended in this particular territory. The control that served him everywhere else was encountering something it hadn't been trained for. It complicated it, she said. Honest, direct, the only way she knew. It didn't. It didn't erase it. I wanted it to. That would have been simpler. The winter light from the high window fell across the table between them, thin and honest, showing everything clearly without warmth. She heard him exhale, very quietly, barely audible, the sound of a tension released by a single fraction. I should have told you, he said, from the beginning, before we... He stopped. His eyes moved to the framework between them, the densely annotated pages, the two handwritings so thoroughly interwoven. I told myself the work mattered more, that if I said it at the start, you would leave, and the work would not happen. And the work matters. He looked at her. But I was also. It was not only about the work. She felt the last words land, not with impact, with a slow spreading weight, like ink dropped into water, dispersing through everything. It was not only about the work. She thought about Tuesdays. She thought about the cup of tea made automatically, the second cup, black without sugar, the knowledge of his preference that had accumulated without permission. She thought about the annotated margin, the had in his voice, the snow on his shoulders this morning. She thought about the conference room becoming a specific place rather than a neutral one, acquiring the texture of their particular occupancy. And she thought about the sleeve brushing his arm in the doorway that she had felt for the rest of that walk. She looked at him. He was looking back. The grey of his eyes in the winter light held something she had been watching approach for weeks. Something that had been pressing close to the surface through all the careful management and measured distance. Something that the 6 weeks of formality had not dispersed, but simply held in suspension, and which was now, in the thin, honest light of a December morning, refusing suspension any further. I know, she said quietly. It wasn't only about the work for me either. The silence that followed was nothing like the silences of their early weeks. It held no history, no hostility, no accumulated weight of what they had been. It was entirely present tense, entirely the two of them in a room in winter, with snow somewhere outside and a framework on the table between them that bore both their marks, and something unresolved and significant suspended in the air that neither of them, yet, knew how to cross toward. His hand rested on the table. Her hand rested on the table. The distance between them was measurable, specific, and for the first time she felt it not as appropriate professional space, but simply as distance. She did not close it, not yet, but she felt, with a clarity she had not felt in 6 weeks, that she wanted to. Outside, the December sky pressed its grey weight against the high window, and somewhere in the ministry's depths a clock struck noon, and neither of them moved, and the not moving felt for the first time like a choice rather than an avoidance. The presentation was in 3 weeks. Hermione had written this on a piece of parchment and pinned it above her desk at home, which was something she did with deadlines, made them visible, gave them physical presence in her space so that the work they represented remained concrete rather than abstract. The parchment was practical. The fact that she had written it the evening after the December Tuesday meeting, within an hour of arriving home, still in her coat, her bag not yet unpacked, that was less about practicality and more about needing something to do with her hands, while her mind worked through what had been said in a conference room that afternoon. It was not only about the work for me either. She had said that. The words were hers, spoken in her own voice, and she had not retracted them, and she was not going to, because she did not retract true things simply because they were inconvenient. This was a principle she held about herself and intended to continue holding, even when the true thing in question had been spoken across a ministry table to Draco Malfoy and had landed in the air between them with the specific gravity of something that could not be unsaid. What had followed, the remainder of that afternoon, the careful reassembly of professional focus, the work that had continued because the work was real and the deadline was real, and they were both, whatever else was true, people who finished what they started, had been conducted in the altered atmosphere of mutual acknowledgement, not resolved, not acted upon, but acknowledged the way certain changes in weather are acknowledged before they arrive. The shift in air pressure, the particular quality of light, the knowledge that something is coming, even if the form it will take remains unclear. She had gone home and pinned the parchment above her desk and made dinner and not thought about it, with the focused deliberateness of someone thinking about something constantly. The Thursday of the following week brought frost, the kind that silvered every surface overnight and made the morning streets look briefly ceremonial, as though the city had been dressed for something. Hermione noticed it on the walk to the ministry, and then noticed she was noticing it, which was the kind of recursive awareness she associated with states of heightened sensitivity. The way everything became slightly more visible when the inner landscape was in motion. Their Tuesday meeting had been normal, professionally normal, which was different from the formality of the preceding weeks in ways she was still calibrating. The acknowledged thing between them hadn't been discussed further. They had both, by some tacit mutual agreement, returned to the work. But the quality of the return was different, less contracted. The formality had softened, not into what they'd had before the letter, but into something new, something that knew more than the previous ease had known, and was therefore both more comfortable and more charged. He had made the tea on Tuesday. She had noted this without comment. Thursday was not a scheduled meeting day. She was working on the presentation structure at her desk, the sequence of sections, the narrative arc of the argument, the way the visual materials would support rather than duplicate the spoken content, when her office door opened and Pansy Parkinson walked in. Hermione looked up. Pansy Parkinson had changed since Hogwarts in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible ways. She was composed with an adult's composure rather than an adolescent's performance of it. Her dark hair severe and precise, her robes expensive but understated. The less visible ways were things Hermione had heard through the particular information network of post-war wizarding London. That Pansy had quietly severed ties with several of her family's former associations. That she worked now in wizarding law. That she had been seen at functions she would not previously have attended. None of this had intersected with Hermione's life in any direct way before this moment. She stood in the doorway with the specific posture of someone who has decided to do something they are not entirely certain of, and looked at Hermione with black eyes that held intelligence and something considerably more complicated. "I need 5 minutes," she said, not imperious. Something more careful than that. Hermione gestured to the chair across from her desk. Pansy sat. She did not arrange herself with the elaborate territorial ease she had deployed through their school years. She sat like someone who had come to say something difficult and was not going to dress it in pretense. "Draco doesn't know I'm here," she said. "I assumed. What I'm going to tell you, he would consider it an interference." A pause. "He would be right. I'm interfering because I have decided the situation warrants it." Hermione held her quill, said nothing. "He submitted that petition," Pansy said, 2 weeks after he returned from his 8th year. He had been back for 14 days. He was sleeping 4 hours a night. He had not spoken to most of the people he grew up with because he couldn't. She stopped, precise and deliberate, as though editing herself in real time. The dark mark was still giving him pain. Not dark magic pain. The ordinary pain of scar tissue. Which is worse in some ways. She paused and looked at Hermione with the directness of someone who has decided that indirection is a luxury they cannot afford. "He wrote the petition at 2 in the morning. I know this because I was there. He showed it to me before he filed it, and I told him it was the most catastrophically vulnerable thing he'd ever done, and he should file it immediately, and he did." She looked at her hands briefly, then back. "The name on the petition was not yours, but the description, Muggle-born, academic record, active in the reconciliation efforts, there was only ever one person it was going to be." Hermione set the quill down. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Pansy said, with the precise economy of someone who has prepared this answer, "he will not. He told you he should have said it from the beginning, I expect." And then he stopped there, because Draco believes that accountability means naming what he did wrong and then getting out of the way of the consequences. He does not believe. She paused again, and something moved across her expression that was not quite softness, but was adjacent to it. He does not believe that he is allowed to want things from the situation he created. He named the error. He's waiting for you to determine the outcome. He will wait indefinitely. He will not push. The room was quiet. Outside Hermione's window, real window, her office had one, the frost-silvered morning continued its cold ceremony. "And you think I should determine the outcome?" Hermione said. "I think you already have." Pansy stood. The composure was fully back in place, the brief aperture closing. "I think you determined it some time ago, and you have been waiting for sufficient justification. I am providing it." She moved to the door, and then paused and turned, and said something that Hermione had not expected from this woman in any version of events she might have anticipated. "He is trying. I know you have no reason to weight that heavily, given everything. But I have known Draco Malfoy since we were 4 years old, and I know the difference between performance and effort, and what he is doing, what he has been doing since before he filed that petition, is the hardest thing I have ever watched him do. She looked at Hermione steadily. I thought you should have that information. She left. Her footsteps in the corridor were quiet and receded quickly, as though she had no interest in the aftermath of what she'd said. Hermione sat for a long time. She thought about what it meant to make yourself vulnerable in writing at 2 in the morning. She thought about scar tissue and 4 hours of sleep, and the particular courage of deciding that the most direct confrontation available to you was the right one, even when it was devastating to arrange. She thought about the marginalia in the framework, growing more expansive as the weeks passed, less guarded, a mind making itself increasingly legible on the page. She thought about the way he had said had, and the way he had said we, and the way he had not pushed for a single thing since she had asked for time, simply waited, simply continued showing up. She thought about what it cost to wait like that, what it required to stay present in a situation where you had made yourself the source of someone's complication and had decided that the only honorable response was to remain in place and let the consequences arrive as they would. She stood up, put her coat on. The walk to the lift was not long. The lift to level 4 was not long. The corridor to the conference room was not long. None of the geography was long, and yet she was aware of each step with the particular heightened clarity of someone moving towards something they have decided to move toward, the world made vivid by the fact of intention. She pushed open the conference room door. He was there. Not a scheduled day, but he was there, seated at the pale table with his folder open and his quill moving, working alone in the conference room on a non-meeting Thursday, as though the work were reason enough to be in this specific room, at this specific table, rather than his own office. He looked up when she entered. She stood in the doorway. His quill stopped moving. The morning light through the high window was thin and silver, the frost-quality light of a winter day that had not been asked to pretend. It fell across the table, across the 2 empty chairs, across the careful distance of the room. She sat down, not in her usual chair, across from him, but in the chair beside his. The geography of it different, deliberate, the table no longer between them, but alongside them. He looked at her, said nothing. The presentation, she said. I think we should rehearse it together, the spoken sections, not just the structure. She opened her folder, placed it on the table. Her elbow was 6 inches from his. The proximity was acute, and neither of them moved to adjust it. I think the argument is stronger when both voices are present. His pen rested against his knuckle, the familiar small drum of it once, and then still. Agreed, he said quietly. She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at him, without the protective management of the preceding weeks, without the earlier hostility, with the clear attention she gave to things she was no longer willing to look away from. He looked back. The silver light held them both in it, unhurried, and said nothing, and asked for nothing. And the space between their elbows was 6 inches, and then 5, and then neither of them was counting. The rehearsals began that Thursday, and continued through the following week, with a frequency that exceeded what the presentation strictly required. Hermione knew this. She suspected he knew it too. Neither of them said anything about it, which was itself a kind of saying something. The mutual, unspoken acknowledgement that the rehearsals had become something other than purely preparatory, that the hours in the conference room were being sought rather than simply scheduled, and that the seeking was mutual, and that this fact was living openly between them now, like a piece of furniture that had arrived without being ordered, and which both parties had decided, without discussion, to keep. They had moved permanently to the side-by-side configuration. This too had gone unacknowledged. It had simply happened. She had sat beside him on that Thursday, and had sat beside him on the Friday and the following Tuesday, and the geography had settled into a new default. The table alongside them rather than between them, the pale wood no longer a managed distance, but a shared surface. Their folders overlapped at the edges. Their notes had begun migrating onto each other's pages in the way of things that no longer observe strict borders. The rehearsals themselves were good. She had been right about the argument being stronger with both voices. His cadence complemented hers in ways she found herself noticing with the particular attention she no longer pretended was purely professional. He spoke to the framework's more structural elements with a precision that grounded her more expansive arguments. And when she built toward the emotional case, the children, the inheritance they hadn't chosen, the school that needed to be different, she could hear him adjust beside her, the quality of his attention shifting to something more internal. And it shaped her delivery without either of them having to choreograph it. They were building something that sounded, she thought, like two people who understood each other. On the Wednesday before the presentation, they stayed late. Not by design. The afternoon had extended itself naturally, the work generating more work in the way of things going well, and the ministry had quieted around them until the conference room existed in a kind of insulated stillness. The building's daytime rhythms replaced by the particular hush of evening corridors and distant cleaning charms. The enchanted windows had shifted to a deep winter dark, and someone, she wasn't certain when, had lit the candles in the wall sconces rather than using the overhead light, which meant the room was warmer in register, and the light was amber rather than neutral, and everything looked slightly different in it. She had noticed this approximately 40 minutes ago and had not mentioned it. They were working through the third section of the presentation, the pilot program, the four-house approach, the specific language around trauma-informed pedagogy. And she was standing at the narrow wallboard where they had pinned the section summaries, reading through the sequence, when she became aware that he had gone quiet. Not the quiet of focused work, a different quality. She turned. He was looking at the wallboard, at the pinned summaries, at the accumulated evidence of what they had built since September, the sections in her handwriting and his, the evolution of the argument across 4 months of Tuesday and Friday mornings, the whole arc of it visible in the amber light. He was looking at it the way she had seen him look at things when he thought no one was watching, with the guard absent, with the careful composure not performing, something real and unmanaged moving through his expression. She had seen this look before, only in stolen moments. It was the look of someone who had not expected this, had not expected the work, the room, the months, the person beside him. and was encountering the accumulated weight of it in a way that briefly exceeded his management capacity. She did not look away. She let herself look at him, looking at it, and felt the amber light and the quiet of the empty building around them, and felt very precisely where she was and who she was here with, and allowed herself, for the first time, without immediately redirecting the feeling, to understand what that meant. He noticed her looking. The expression didn't shut her completely. That was new, she noted. 6 weeks ago, it would have. The guard would have reinstated itself fully the moment he registered her attention. Now it only composed itself slightly, softened the most exposed aspects, but left the rest, left enough. "Sorry," he said, not specifying what he was apologizing for. "Don't be," she said, also not specifying. He looked at the wallboard again. 4 months, he said. Almost. "It's good work." "It's very good work," she said, and meant it entirely. The work and the other thing inside the work, the thing that had been building in the margins, and the amber light, and the side-by-side configuration, and all the accumulated hours that had done something to both of them, that neither a ministry assignment nor a carefully maintained professional distance had been able to prevent. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't expect..." He stopped. "No," she said. "Neither did I." The admission moved between them through the still air, with a particular quality of things that are true and known and finally spoken without the buffer of professional language. She watched him absorb it, the slight shift in his posture, the breath that moved through him and changed something in the set of his shoulders. She returned to the wallboard. Her finger moved along the pinned summaries, not reading them now, just touching the edges of pages, a tactile occupation while her mind moved through something larger. "The section on inherited values," she said. "When we present it, I think you should deliver that part." She felt him still behind her. "The framework talks about children who've been given a moral inheritance they didn't choose," she continued. Her voice was even, but she could feel the careful quality of it, the effort of steadiness. "Someone who's actually navigated that should say it. The committee will hear it differently coming from you." She paused. "It will be more true." The word "true" sat in the amber air. She was still looking at the wallboard, her back to him, and she heard him. Not move, not speak, but something, some slight rearrangement of the atmosphere behind her that indicated a response occurring below the level of words. "Granger." His voice was different, lower than its working register, rougher at the edges in a way that the controlled smoothness of his everyday speech didn't usually permit. She turned. He was standing, had stood at some point in the last moments, and was closer than the geography of the room had previously established as their default. Not drastically closer, a step closer. Enough that the distance between them had changed category, from the comfortable proximity of colleagues to something that required a different name. He was looking at her with the expression she had now seen enough iterations of to understand. The thing that moved through his eyes when the management failed slightly, when the controlled surface admitted more than he'd intended, when she could see what was underneath the composure, and it was considerable, and it was entirely directed at her. She did not step back. She noted the choice with the clear awareness of someone who has decided to make it consciously. "I have spent a great deal of time," he said, with the careful precision of someone who has been constructing this sentence for longer than the current moment, attempting to determine whether what I... He stopped. His jaw tightened. She watched him push through the thing his instinct toward control kept trying to interrupt. Whether I have any right to want things from a situation I created by not being honest with you. What do you want? She asked. The directness of it, her natural register, always the blunt instrument of the honest question, landed in the space between them, and she watched its effect move through him. A single breath taken and released, the smallest dissolution of distance, an inch barely measurable, but there. I want... He stopped again. His hand moved slightly at his side, not reaching, just shifting weight. This. The word was quiet and entirely undecorated. This room. The work. What it's been. What it is. He looked at her steadily. You. She felt the word in her chest as a specific physical thing. Not a shock, not a surprise exactly, but the arrival of something that had been approaching for a long time and had now crossed the threshold, and the crossing was irreversible, and she did not want it reversed. Draco, she said, and his name in her voice, his given name, made something happen in his expression that she had no precedent for. Something that opened, something that had no composure in it at all, briefly, just the unmanaged face of someone who has heard their name from a specific person for the first time and understood what it meant in that mouth. I want those things too, she said. He was very still, as though the stillness were necessary to hold what she had said in place, to keep it from becoming uncertain. I've wanted them for longer than I was prepared to admit, she continued. Her hands were at her sides. Her heart was doing something unreasonable behind her ribs, and she was absolutely and clearly present in every inch of herself. Since before the letter complicated it. It isn't the origin of this. The origin of this is 4 months in this room with you, and the marginalia, and the tea, and... She stopped, and something between a breath and a sound moved through her. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything else, just the release of feeling that had been administered for too long. And the way you hold your quill when you're thinking versus when you're writing. He stared at her. I notice things, she said. I've been noticing things about you for months, and I stopped pretending I wasn't some time ago. The amber light held them both. The building was quiet around them. His eyes moved across her face, the way she had seen him read things he was trying to fully understand. With complete attention, taking nothing for granted, letting the meaning arrive rather than rushing toward it. His hand, left hand, the one with the signet ring, the one with the concealed scar beneath the sleeve, rose slowly, and he stopped halfway through the movement, and she saw the hesitation in it, the old instinct toward restraint, meeting something that wanted to be otherwise. And she watched him decide, and then watched his hand continue its movement, and his fingers came to rest against her jaw, barely there, the lightest possible contact, as though he had decided to ask the question through touch rather than words, and was waiting for the answer. She reached up and placed her hand over his. The candle nearest to them shifted in some unfelt draft, the flame leaning sideways, the shadow of them on the pale wall moving, stretching together, merging at the edges. He breathed her name. Just her name. Just Hermione, the 3 syllables she had heard from 100 people in 100 registers, and never like this. Careful and rough, and held like something fragile and real. She looked at him in the amber light, his hand warm against her jaw, her hand warm over his, and felt the 4 months of this room and this work and this incremental, resistant, complicated, entirely real thing between them arrive at a single present moment that did not ask for resolution yet. Only presence. Only this. The presentation was in 2 days. The framework was finished. The committee was waiting. None of it, for the length of this moment, was the most important thing in the room. The morning of the presentation arrived with snow. Not the tentative, apologetic snow of early December that had dusted Draco's shoulders in the conference room doorway. This was January snow, committed and deliberate, covering the city overnight in a white that made everything look in the early morning light like a first draft. Clean, unwritten, the particular quality of a morning that did not yet know what it would become. Hermione stood at her kitchen window with her tea and watched it and felt the strange doubled awareness of someone who is simultaneously nervous about a professional event and changed in some fundamental way that makes professional nervousness feel, if not trivial, then differently proportioned than it previously was. The evening in the conference room, the amber light, his hand against her jaw, her name in his voice, had ended without a kiss. She wanted to be clear about this in her own mind because the clarity mattered. They had stood in that warm contact for a long moment, his thumb moving once, slowly across her cheekbone, and then she had turned her face slightly and pressed her lips to his palm. Not a kiss in the full sense, something smaller and more deliberate, a placement of intention. And he had exhaled the way someone does when a long-held breath is finally released. And then they had stood in the amber light of the emptied building, with their foreheads almost touching and not quite touching, and the whole complicated, beautiful weight of 4 months between them. And they had not kissed, because the moment had not required it yet, because some things earn their completion. She had walked home through the winter dark feeling more fully present in her own body than she had in months. They had not spoken since. This too had felt correct. Not avoidance, nothing like the December distance, but a kind of held breath between the evening and whatever came next. The presentation was the next fixed point. Everything was navigating toward it. She arrived at the ministry at 8. The atrium was quieter than usual, the snow having delayed or deterred the peripheral staff, the main corridors holding only the purposeful movement of people with specific places to be. She rode the lift to level 4 and walked to the committee room, larger than their conference room, set up with chairs and a presentation board, and the slight additional formality of a room that knew it was being used for something official. He was there. He was standing at the window, the real one set high in the wall, and he was looking at the snow, and she had a sudden, layered sense of recognition. The same posture as that November Tuesday when she had caught him unguarded, the same quality of stillness, except that this time when he heard her enter, he turned immediately, and his expression was not the quick reassembly of composure over something exposed. It was simply open, prepared for her specifically, arranged for no one else. Dark robes, precisely fitted, the Malfoy posture he had been born into, and which now read to her not as entitlement, but as the particular uprightness of someone who has decided that bearing matters. His hair was neat. His eyes found her across the room with a direct attention that had ceased, at some point in the past months, to feel like assessment, and had become simply regard. The quality of someone who looks at you because you are the thing they want to look at. "You're early," he said. "So are you." The ghost of the almost smile. No longer a ghost, she noticed. It arrived fully now, briefly, quiet and real. "Habit," he said. She set her bag down. The presentation materials were already laid out. He had arranged them, she saw, in the sequence they had rehearsed, with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Her sections and his sections interleaved in the order they had built together, the whole argument laid out on the table like a map of the past 4 months. "How are you?" she asked. The simple question, and she meant it simply. Not a formality, not an opener to something else. Just the genuine inquiry of someone who had recently learned that this person's answer mattered to her in a specific and irreversible way. He looked at her for a moment. "Better than I expected to be," he said. Honest, the way he had learned to be with her, incrementally, expensively, one true thing at a time. "You?" "Nervous," she said. "About the presentation." "Only the presentation?" The question arrived with a delicacy that was entirely characteristic of the Draco Malfoy she had been assembling across 4 months of conference room mornings. The one who asked oblique questions rather than direct ones when the direct ones carried too much weight, who tested ground before placing his full weight on it, who had learned, slowly, that she would not punish him for what he found there. "Nervous about the presentation," she said, "and otherwise." She paused, letting the word hold everything it needed to hold. Entirely certain. Something moved through his expression at that. The deep, brief movement she had catalogued from beneath the surface, except that it didn't retreat this time. It stayed, settled into something visible and calm and entirely his. "Good," he said quietly. "So am I." The committee arrived at 9. 6 members, senior ministry officials whose collective attention carried the weight of institutional judgment, seated in a row with the particular seriousness of people who have read the preliminary draft and have questions prepared. Hermione knew 2 of them well. She did not know whether any of them had read the journalist's letter from December. It had, as Draco predicted, been published, though its impact had been less dramatic than threatened. The uncensored cauldron was not the Daily Prophet, and the story had not gained the traction its author had clearly hoped for. But she was aware of the possibility of its shadow in the room, and she noted it and set it aside, because the work was good, and the work was what they were here for. They presented in the order they had rehearsed. She opened the framework's context, the research basis, the methodology. Her voice was steady, and she could feel herself inhabiting the material fully, the way she only could with things she genuinely believed in. She watched the committee's faces for the micro-expressions of engaged attention versus polite attention, and found, with satisfaction, the former. They were listening, the real kind. He took the structural sections. She watched him from beside the presentation board while he spoke, watched the committee watching him, Watch the particular quality of attention that he commanded in a room, the intelligence in it, the precision of his arguments. He was not performing. That was the thing she had been waiting to see, confirmed in this formal context, where performance would have been the easiest choice. He was simply present, simply accurate, simply himself. Then the pilot program section, the four-house approach, the trauma-informed pedagogy. He took that section, as she had suggested. She watched him stand before the committee and speak about children who inherit the consequences of choices they never made, about the difference between the history a child is given and the history a child can make, about the specific necessity of a school that teaches this distinction explicitly and early. He spoke without notes. His voice carried the particular resonance of someone speaking from inside a subject rather than about it. And she saw the moment the committee understood this. A slight forward adjustment in 3 of the 6 chairs, the body language of people who have just registered that something real is being said by someone for whom it is real. When he finished, there was a silence of the good kind, the kind that follows something that needs a moment before it can be responded to. The committee chair, a tall witch named Clearwater, whose judgment Hermione respected, looked at them both for a moment before speaking. "This is the strongest submission the initiative has received," she said, "by a considerable margin." A pause. "I'd like to ask one question before we move to the formal review." She looked at them, at the 2 of them, side by side before the presentation board, the 40 centimeters of space between them that was a different 40 centimeters than it would have been 4 months ago. How did you make this work? The question was not about methodology. Hermione understood this immediately, and from the slight shift beside her, she understood that he did too. She thought about how to answer. She thought about conference rooms and annotated margins and cups of tea and manufactured skies giving way to honest winter. She thought about the note pressed small into the margin. Consider that proximity to violence is not the same as complicity in it, and the single word she had written beneath it. She thought about amber candlelight and a hand against her jaw, and her name spoken in a voice that had never said it that way before. "Slowly," she said. A small sound beside her, barely audible, almost nothing. The sound of someone containing something. She did not look at him. She felt him beside her the way she felt the whole room, precisely with the heightened clarity of someone entirely present. Clearwater's expression moved into something that was not quite a smile, but was its warmer relative. "That's an honest answer," she said. The formal review that followed was thorough and positive. The committee had amendments, minor structural suggestions, a request for additional data in one subsection. But the framework was approved in principle, the pilot program greenlit for the spring term. When the committee filed out, Clearwater paused beside Hermione at the door and said quietly, "Well done, both of you," with an emphasis on both that was deliberate and kind. Then they were alone in the committee room, with the snow still falling beyond the high window, and the presentation material spread across the table, and the particular stunned quality of 2 people who have just been told that the thing they work toward is real. Hermione stood still for a moment, felt the morning, the snow, the completed thing. Then she turned, and he was already looking at her. Had been looking at her, she suspected, since the committee began filing out. And his expression held something she had never seen on him before. Not the composure, not the careful management, not the controlled surface. Simply joy. Quiet and unperformed, and entirely real. The expression of someone who had worked for something hard and seen it become true, and who was looking at the person beside whom it became true with a regard that contained everything the past 4 months had built between them. She crossed the 40 centimeters. Not rushing. She had never been someone who rushed toward things she had decided on, preferring intention over momentum, but moving with the clear directness of a person who has been certain since yesterday evening and has simply been waiting for the right moment to let certainty become action. She placed her hand flat against his chest. She felt him go still beneath it, the held quality of someone receiving something they have wanted carefully and are afraid to disturb. "Draco," she said. He brought his hand up and covered hers the way she had covered his in the amber candlelight, the mirror of it, the returning. His other hand rose to her face, her jaw, the same placement as before, but firmer this time, not a question this time. His thumb traced her cheekbone with the focused deliberateness of someone committing something to a memory they intend to keep. "Hermione," he said, her name again in that register, the careful and rough and entirely real register that she suspected she would feel in her chest for the rest of her life every time she heard it this way. She leaned up and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss, and it was not an overwhelming one. It was a decided kiss, warm and precise and held, the way she did things she was certain of, the way he received it with both hands steady on her face and the whole composed architecture of him, finally, fully, without reserve releasing into the simple present of this. When they drew back, it was slowly, neither willing to rush the ending of it, and they stood with their foreheads resting together in the snow-lit quiet of a ministry committee room that would never know what had happened in it. And she felt his breath against her lips, and felt the solid warmth of him, and felt, underneath all of it, the particular sensation she associated with true things, the settling, the click of something aligning. 4 months, he said quietly, the same words as Wednesday, carrying considerably more now. "Almost," she said. His smile arrived fully, not the ghost of it, not the suggestion, the whole thing, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought she would like to see it again as many times as possible, in as many rooms as remained available to them. Outside the high window, the January snow continued its unhurried work, covering the city in clean white, rewriting surfaces, making everything look like the beginning of something, which it was.
This story is about two people who could not stand each other, and then, slowly, they could not stand to be apart. I wanted to write something real, not a fairy tale, not love at first sight, but love that costs something, love that asks you to look at yourself honestly, love that grows in small moments, a cup of tea, a note in a margin, and a hand in a jar in candlelight. Draco is not a hero in this story. He made wrong choices. He carried guilt he could not say out loud. But he tired, quietly, consistently, without asking for a reward. And I think that matters. Hermione is strong, everyone knows that, but strange is not the same as being unbreakable. She is vulnerable here. She is uncertain. She is human. I think that matters too. We live in a world that moves very fast. We want answer immediately. We want feeling to be simple and clear. But real feeling are not simple. Real change is not fast. Real trust is built slowly in small rooms over many weeks, one honest word at a time. That is what this story is really about. Not magic, not Hogwarts, not the war, just two people choosing to stay in the room, choosing to try. Thank you for listening. This one was written with a lot of care. I hope you felt it.